KWAME Nkrumah, born on September 21st, 1909, in Crowful, in the western region of the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, emerged as one of the most influential African leaders of the 20th century. His early life and education played a critical role in shaping his political ideology and leadership style. Understanding the socio-cultural context of Nkrumah's formative years is essential to grasp the foundations of his later political activism. Nkrumah was born into the Nzima ethnic group, a matrilineal community with a rich tradition of oral history and resistance to colonial rule. His father, Kofi Nganloma, was a respected goldsmith and a member of the local council, which exposed young Kwame to ideas about leadership and community governance from an early age. The influence of his family and local community instilled in him a strong sense of identity and responsibility. His initial education took place in mission schools, which were widespread in the Gold Coast at the time due to the influence of Christian missionaries. These schools provided a Western-style education and were instrumental in introducing Nkrumah to English language and literature, as well as Christian ethics. Although the mission schools promoted colonial values, they also inadvertently equipped many African students, including Nkrumah, with the intellectual tools to critique colonialism. After completing primary education, Nkrumah attended the prestigious Achimota School in Accra, an institution known for its progressive curriculum designed to prepare Africans for leadership roles under colonial rule. At Achimota, Nkrumah excelled academically and participated in various extracurricular activities, developing skills in public speaking and debate. The school's ethos emphasized self-reliance and African pride, which resonated with Nkrumah and deepened his awareness of the colonial inequalities faced by his people. Following Achimota, Nkrumah began his career as a teacher, a common profession among educated Africans at the time. His initial teaching positions in the Gold Coast allowed him to observe the colonial system's impact on ordinary citizens and to engage with young minds about issues of national identity and self-determination. This period marked the beginning of Nkrumah's commitment to education as a means of empowerment. In 1935, driven by a desire to pursue higher education and broaden his horizons, Nkrumah traveled to the United States. This move was significant, marking the beginning of his exposure to global political thought and activism. He enrolled at Lincoln University, a historically black institution in Pennsylvania, where he studied theology and philosophy. Lincoln University was a vibrant intellectual hub, hosting numerous African-American thinkers who were deeply engaged in debates on race, colonialism, and nationalism. During his time in the United States, Nkrumah was profoundly influenced by the works of W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and other Pan-Africanists. These thinkers advocated for the unity of African peoples and the reclamation of African dignity through political independence and cultural revival. Nkrumah's exposure to these ideas solidified his belief that political liberation was inseparable from cultural and economic emancipation. In addition to his studies, Nkrumah became actively involved in student organizations and civil rights activism. He participated in demonstrations against racial segregation and discrimination, experiences that heightened his awareness of systemic injustice and the need for organized resistance. This period also introduced him to Marxist and socialist literature, which would later inform his vision for a new African society. After Lincoln University, Nkrumah pursued graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied economics and sociology. His academic work focused on the socio-economic conditions in colonial Africa, reinforcing his conviction that political independence must be accompanied by social and economic reforms to dismantle colonial exploitation. His scholarly background provided him with a unique analytical framework that distinguished him from many contemporaries. In 1945, Nkrumah moved to London, where he continued his activism among the African diaspora and engaged with Pan-Africanist movements. His time in London was marked by participation in conferences and the founding of organizations that aimed to unite Africans and promote independence across the continent. This period was a crucial bridge between his intellectual formation and his practical involvement in African nationalism. Kwame Nkrumah's political awakening was a gradual process that intensified during his years abroad, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom. This period was crucial in transforming him from a student into a committed activist, deeply invested in the cause of African liberation. Unlike the formal education of his early years, his political awakening was experiential, shaped by the political climate of the African diaspora and global movements against imperialism and racism. In the United States, Nkrumah encountered a vibrant African American community engaged in the struggle for civil rights and racial equality. The pervasive racial discrimination and segregation he witnessed were stark reminders of the global reach of racial oppression, fueling his determination to fight colonialism not only in Africa, but within a broader context of racial justice. The dynamic activism and intellectual ferment of African American circles exposed him to revolutionary ideas about social change and the power of organized political action. Nkrumah's engagement with Pan-Africanist thought began to deepen as he connected with leaders and intellectuals who advocated for the unity and empowerment of African peoples worldwide. Figures such as W.B. Du Bois and George Padmore played significant roles in shaping his political philosophy. Du Bois' emphasis on the political and cultural unity of Africans and people of African descent resonated strongly with Nkrumah's growing sense of African identity and purpose. While in the United Kingdom, Nkrumah became even more involved in Pan-African organizations. He participated in the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, a landmark event that brought together prominent African and Caribbean leaders committed to ending colonial rule. This Congress was instrumental in galvanizing a new wave of nationalist leaders, and Nkrumah's involvement signaled his emergence as a key figure in the struggle for African independence. The Congress also highlighted the necessity of coordinated action among African colonies and the diaspora. Nkrumah adopted this principle, believing that the liberation of Africa required solidarity beyond national boundaries. His commitment to Pan-Africanism extended beyond political independence to encompass cultural revival, economic cooperation, and social justice across the continent. During this time, Nkrumah also developed his critique of colonialism's economic underpinnings. He observed that political freedom without economic control would leave African nations vulnerable to neo-colonial exploitation. This economic dimension became central to his vision, distinguishing him from other nationalist leaders who focused primarily on political sovereignty. Nkrumah's political awakening was not without ideological influences from socialism and Marxism. His readings introduced him to concepts of class struggle, imperialism, and a need for a radical restructuring of society. He saw socialism as a pathway to achieve equitable development and social justice in post-colonial Africa, rejecting capitalist models that had perpetuated inequality and dependence. As his political consciousness sharpened, Nkrumah began to articulate a vision for a liberated Africa that was united, socially just, and economically self-reliant. This vision challenged colonial narratives that portrayed African societies as fragmented and incapable of self-governance. Instead, Nkrumah emphasized African agency and the continent's potential to forge its destiny through unity and progressive leadership. By the time Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast in 1947, he had already established himself as a politically mature and ideologically driven leader. His political awakening was marked by a synthesis of Pan-Africanism, socialism, and nationalism, setting the stage for his active engagement in the liberation struggle. This phase of his life was pivotal in defining the trajectory of his leadership and the strategies he would employ. Upon Kwame Nkrumah's return to the Gold Coast in late 1947, the political landscape was rife with tension and eager anticipation for change. The colonial government maintained strict control, while various nationalist groups pushed for gradual reforms. It was within this volatile environment that Nkrumah began to chart a new course for political activism, ultimately leading to the founding of the Convention People's Party, CPP. Initially, Nkrumah joined the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC, the foremost nationalist organization at the time, which sought to achieve self-government through constitutional means. However, Nkrumah quickly became disillusioned with the UGCC's conservative approach and elitist leadership. The UGCC's focus on negotiation and incremental change clashed with his belief in immediate and mass-driven action to secure independence. Nkrumah's growing impatience with the UGCC's tactics prompted him to build a grassroots movement that directly engaged the common people, particularly the working class and youth. He believed that political power should derive from the masses rather than from colonial authorities or traditional elites. This approach marked a significant departure from the elitist nationalism prevalent among established leaders. In June 1949, after a series of disagreements with the UGCC leadership, Nkrumah broke away to form the Convention People's Party, CPP. The CPP was founded on principles of self-reliance, direct action, and mass mobilization. Its slogan, "Self-Government Now," captured the urgency and radicalism that characterized the party's platform. The CPP's founding was accompanied by a well-organized campaign to educate and mobilize the populace. Nkrumah utilized his skills as a charismatic orator and organizer to rally support across diverse social groups. He traveled extensively throughout the Gold Coast, holding public meetings, rallies, and educational sessions aimed at raising political consciousness and inspiring collective action. One of the CPP's early tactics was the use of positive action, a form of civil disobedience that included strikes, boycotts, and demonstrations. These actions sought to disrupt colonial administration and force the British authorities to concede to demands for self-rule. The concept of positive action resonated with many Ghanaians who were frustrated by the slow pace of political reform. The CPP also emphasized the importance of youth and women in the liberation struggle. Nkrumah encouraged the formation of youth leagues and women's groups within the party, recognizing that broad-based participation was essential to sustaining momentum. This inclusive strategy helped expand the party's reach beyond urban centers into rural communities. The colonial government responded to the CPP's activities with repression, including arrests of key leaders and bans on public gatherings. Nkrumah himself was imprisoned in 1950 for his role in organizing protests, a move that paradoxically increased his popularity and solidified his image as a committed nationalist willing to suffer for the cause. Despite these challenges, the CPP's influence grew rapidly, drawing support from a wide cross-section of society, including trade unions, farmers, and intellectuals. The party's emphasis on immediate independence distinguished it from other groups advocating for a gradual transition under continued British oversight. By the early 1950s, the CPP had effectively transformed the political scene in the Gold Coast, establishing itself as the primary vehicle for nationalist aspirations. The party's ability to unite diverse social forces under a common goal of self-government demonstrated Nkrumah's organizational genius and strategic insight. The period following the establishment of the Convention People's Party, CPP, was marked by a dynamic and intense struggle for Ghana's independence, which became a defining chapter in the history of African decolonization. The movement transitioned from advocacy and protest into a nationwide campaign that challenged the very foundations of colonial rule in the Gold Coast. One of the most critical strategies in this struggle was the mobilization of the working class and peasantry, who constituted the majority of the population, yet were often marginalized under colonial administration. The CPP's alliance with trade unions was instrumental in organizing strikes and demonstrations that disrupted economic activities and applied pressure on the colonial government. In early 1950, the CPP initiated a campaign known as Positive Action, a program of nonviolent resistance involving boycotts, strikes, and civil disobedience. This marked the first time a political party in the Gold Coast openly challenged British authority with coordinated mass action. The campaign sought to paralyze the colonial economy and force political concessions. The colonial authorities reacted swiftly and harshly to Positive Action. Leaders of the CPP, including Nkrumah, were arrested and imprisoned on charges of sedition. Nkrumah's imprisonment, however, only galvanized public support for the independence movement. His incarceration transformed him into a symbol of resistance and sacrifice, elevating his stature among Ghanaians. During Nkrumah's imprisonment, the CPP continued to build its grassroots network, expanding its influence into rural areas where colonial control was weaker, but where political awareness was growing. This outreach was critical in ensuring broad-based support, essential for the sustainability of the independence movement. International developments also played a role in the Gold Coast struggle. The aftermath of World War II saw the weakening of European colonial powers and the rise of global movements advocating self-determination. The establishment of the United Nations and its emphasis on human rights provided a platform for colonial subjects to voice their demands. Nkrumah's political acumen was evident as he leveraged international sympathy to pressure Britain. He positioned Ghana's independence struggle within the broader context of global decolonization and anti-imperialism, drawing attention to the contradictions between British democratic ideals and its colonial practices. Negotiations between the colonial government and nationalist leaders intensified after Nkrumah's release from prison in 1951. The British government, facing increasing unrest and international scrutiny, began to concede to demands for greater African participation in governance. A new constitution was introduced, allowing for an expanded legislative assembly with significant African representation. The 1951 elections were a watershed moment. The CPP won a landslide victory, securing 34 of the 38 elected seats. Nkrumah, released from prison, was appointed leader of government business, effectively becoming the head of the Gold Coast administration. This victory marked the first time an African nationalist leader assumed significant political power under colonial rule. Over the next few years, the CPP government implemented policies that laid the groundwork for full sovereignty. These included reforms in education, infrastructure, and health, aimed at building a modern state capable of managing its affairs independently. The government also continued to assert its authority in negotiations with Britain, insisting on immediate self-government. Ghana's achievement of independence on March 6, 1957, was a momentous milestone not only for the Gold Coast, but also for the entire African continent. As the first sub-Saharan African country to break free from colonial rule, Ghana's independence signaled the beginning of a new era. Kwame Nkrumah's role as the country's first prime minister was pivotal in shaping this transformative period, both politically and socially. The transition from colonial rule to self-governance was meticulously planned. After the 1951 elections, the British government agreed to hold another general election in 1954, which further solidified the CPP's mandate. The CPP secured a majority again, allowing Nkrumah to strengthen his government and push for full sovereignty. Negotiations culminated in the approval of a new constitution that would grant Ghana internal self-government. Nkrumah's leadership during this phase was characterized by a strategic balance between diplomacy and assertiveness. He worked closely with British officials, but insisted on the principle of immediate independence rather than a prolonged transitional period. His diplomatic skills ensured that the transfer of power occurred smoothly, avoiding the violent conflicts seen in other colonies. On the historic Day of Independence, Nkrumah delivered a memorable speech at the Black Star Square in Accra, famously declaring, "At long last, the battle has ended, and thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." This declaration embodied the hopes and aspirations of millions who had struggled under colonial domination. As Prime Minister, Nkrumah faced the daunting task of building a new nation from the vestiges of colonial administration. His government prioritized modernization and national integration, recognizing the diverse ethnic, linguistic, and regional identities within Ghana. Nkrumah believed that a strong, unified nation was essential to withstand external pressures and internal divisions. A key focus of his administration was education reform. Nkrumah expanded access to education at all levels, emphasizing technical and vocational training to support industrialization. He viewed education as the foundation for economic development and political stability, intending to create a skilled workforce capable of driving Ghana's progress. Economically, Nkrumah embarked on ambitious development projects, aiming to reduce dependence on raw material exports and diversify the economy. His administration invested heavily in infrastructure, including roads, railways, and hydroelectric power. The construction of the Akasambo Dam, though completed later, was conceived during his tenure as a symbol of Ghana's industrial aspirations. Socially, Nkrumah implemented policies aimed at improving health care, housing, and social welfare. These initiatives were designed to uplift marginalized communities and reduce the stark inequalities left by colonial rule. The government also promoted cultural revival, supporting the arts and indigenous languages to foster national pride. Nkrumah's international role as Ghana's prime minister was equally significant. He positioned Ghana as a leader in the Pan-African movement and a vocal advocate for decolonization across the continent. Ghana hosted important conferences and provided support to liberation movements in other African countries, signaling its commitment to continental solidarity. Despite his successes, Nkrumah's leadership style began to attract criticism for its authoritarian tendencies. He increasingly centralized power, curbed political opposition, and restricted press freedoms, arguing that such measures were necessary to safeguard national unity and development. This approach sowed seeds of political tension that would later challenge his administration. Kwame Nkrumah's political vision extended far beyond the borders of Ghana. From early in his leadership, he conceived of African independence as the first step toward a broader goal: the political, economic, and social unification of the entire African continent. This vision was grounded in a profound belief that only a united Africa could overcome the legacies of colonialism and assert its rightful place in the global order. Nkrumah's commitment to African unity was influenced by his experiences with Pan-Africanism during his years abroad, where he engaged with activists who saw the continent's future as interconnected and indivisible. He argued that colonial boundaries were artificial divisions imposed by foreign powers, designed to fragment African peoples and prevent collective strength. For Nkrumah, dismantling these colonial legacies required bold, supranational political structures. Central to Nkrumah's ideology was the belief that African unity could only be achieved through socialism, a system he viewed as more equitable and suited to Africa's development needs than capitalism. He critiqued capitalism for perpetuating inequality and dependence, particularly in post-colonial states that remained economically tethered to their former colonizers. Socialism, he argued, offered a framework for economic independence, social justice, and the redistribution of wealth. Nkrumah's vision of socialism was adapted to African realities. It emphasized community ownership and collective progress rather than the class antagonisms seen in Western socialist movements. His philosophy drew on traditional African communal values, synthesizing them with modern socialist principles to create a uniquely African path to development. In pursuit of continental unity, Nkrumah championed the creation of regional organizations and alliances that could serve as building blocks for a larger African federation. He was instrumental in the formation of the Organization of African Unity, OU, in 1963, which sought to promote cooperation among independent African states, resolve conflicts peacefully, and coordinate development efforts. Nkrumah also envisioned the establishment of a single African government, complete with a centralized military and economic system. Though this ambitious plan was never fully realized, it inspired many leaders and activists who saw the fragmentation of Africa as the greatest obstacle to true sovereignty and progress. The Ghanaian government under Nkrumah actively supported liberation movements throughout the continent, providing resources, training, and political backing to groups fighting against colonial and minority regimes. This support was both a moral imperative and a strategic effort to weaken imperialist powers and expand the influence of Pan-African ideals. Nkrumah's advocacy for African unity was met with mixed reactions. While many praised his vision, others, particularly some newly independent states, were wary of surrendering sovereignty or aligning too closely with Ghana's political agenda. Regional rivalries, ethnic tensions, and divergent political systems complicated efforts to forge unity. Domestically, Nkrumah's socialist policies were reflected in the nationalization of key industries and state-led economic planning. His administration sought to reduce foreign control of resources and channel profits into public services and infrastructure. These policies aimed to build a self-sufficient economy capable of sustaining Ghana's independence and contributing to continental development. Kwame Nkrumah's vision for Ghana went beyond political sovereignty. He was deeply committed to transforming the country's economic foundations. Recognizing that political independence without economic self-reliance would leave Ghana vulnerable to neo-colonial control, Nkrumah embarked on an ambitious program of economic development and industrialization aimed at modernizing the nation. At the core of Nkrumah's economic strategy was the belief that Ghana needed to reduce its dependence on raw material exports and develop a diversified industrial base. The colonial economy had been structured to extract resources for British benefit, and Nkrumah sought to reverse this pattern by fostering local industries that could add value and create jobs for Ghanaians. One of the flagship projects of Nkrumah's administration was the development of large-scale infrastructure, particularly in energy production. The Akasambo Dam, initiated during his tenure, was envisioned as a massive hydroelectric facility that would provide the power necessary to fuel industrial growth. This project symbolized the country's leap toward modernization and technological advancement. Nkrumah's government also prioritized the establishment of state-owned enterprises to spearhead industrialization. Industries such as manufacturing, textiles, and steel production were promoted to build a foundation for economic diversification. These initiatives aim to create a balanced economy that was less vulnerable to the fluctuations of global commodity markets. Agriculture, which employed the majority of the population, received significant attention. Nkrumah supported modernization programs designed to increase productivity, including the introduction of improved farming techniques and state-sponsored cooperatives. The goal was to generate surplus agricultural produce to feed urban centers and support export revenue. To finance these ambitious projects, the government invested heavily in public spending, often running deficits to fund development plans. Nkrumah believed that state intervention was essential to overcoming the structural limitations inherited from colonialism. However, this approach also led to growing fiscal challenges and increased dependence on external loans. Nkrumah's economic policies were grounded in the principle of economic nationalism. He sought to limit foreign control over critical sectors by imposing regulations and encouraging Ghanaian ownership of businesses. This sometimes created tensions with foreign investors, but reflected his commitment to economic sovereignty. Education and training were integrated into the development agenda. Nkrumah's administration expanded technical and vocational schools to equip Ghanaians with the skills necessary to manage new industries and technologies. This emphasis on human capital development was seen as vital for sustaining long-term economic growth. Despite these efforts, the industrialization drive faced several obstacles. The rapid pace of development strained administrative capacities, and inefficiencies plagued some state enterprises. Corruption and mismanagement emerged as issues, hampering productivity and eroding public confidence in government initiatives. International economic conditions also posed challenges. Ghana's reliance on export revenues made it vulnerable to commodity price fluctuations, while Cold War geopolitics influenced foreign aid and investment flows. Nkrumah's alignment with socialist principles sometimes complicated relations with Western donors. As Kwame Nkrumah's government pursued its ambitious political and economic agenda, Ghana faced a series of complex political challenges that tested the resilience of its young democracy. Nkrumah's increasingly centralized style of governance, coupled with growing internal opposition, led to a shift toward authoritarianism that would significantly impact both his leadership and the nation's political trajectory. The political landscape in Ghana during the late 1950s and early 1960s was marked by rising tensions between the ruling Convention People's Party, CPP, and opposition groups. Many of these groups emerged from various regional, ethnic, and ideological backgrounds, reflecting the diverse and often fragmented nature of Ghanaian society. These divisions created an atmosphere of political contestation that Nkrumah viewed with increasing suspicion. Nkrumah's response to opposition was shaped by his conviction that national unity and rapid development required a strong, centralized authority. He perceived political dissent as a threat not only to his government, but to the very fabric of the nation. This led to a series of legislative measures aimed at curbing opposition activities and consolidating power within the CPP. One of the most significant legal instruments was the Preventive Detention Act of 1958, which granted the government sweeping powers to detain individuals without trial for up to 5 years. This law was used to imprison political opponents, critics, and activists deemed subversive. While it was justified as a necessary tool for maintaining order, the act drew sharp criticism for undermining civil liberties. The CPP's dominance was further cemented in the 1960s through the establishment of a one-party state. In 1964, Ghana officially became a one-party republic under the CPP, effectively outlawing political opposition. This move was rationalized by Nkrumah as essential to avoid ethnic strife and political instability, but it effectively eliminated democratic pluralism. Nkrumah's consolidation of power was accompanied by the expansion of the security apparatus. The government increased surveillance and intelligence operations aimed at identifying and neutralizing perceived enemies of the state. This climate of fear stifled open political debate and led to widespread self-censorship. Despite these authoritarian tendencies, Nkrumah remained popular among many Ghanaians who credited him with national independence and ambitious development programs. His charisma and rhetoric continued to inspire loyalty, particularly among youth and labor groups who saw him as a champion of the common people. However, discontent simmered beneath the surface. Economic difficulties, including inflation and shortages, combined with political repression, led to frustration in certain segments of society. Some traditional leaders and regional elites felt marginalized by the centralized government, exacerbating tensions. Internationally, Nkrumah's authoritarian shift attracted mixed reactions. While some African leaders admired his strong leadership, Western powers and human rights advocates expressed concern over the erosion of democratic freedoms. This added to Ghana's complicated position during the Cold War, as Nkrumah sought support from both Eastern and Western blocs. By the mid-1960s, Kwame Nkrumah's political dominance in Ghana faced mounting pressures both from within the country and abroad. His ambitious programs, authoritarian tendencies, and the challenging economic environment created a climate ripe for upheaval. The culmination of these tensions led to the dramatic overthrow of his government in 1966, marking a profound turning point in his life and Ghana's history. Nkrumah's relationship with the military and police forces had deteriorated considerably by this time. Despite his efforts to maintain control over security institutions, dissatisfaction grew among the ranks due to perceived neglect and politicization. The military, in particular, viewed some of Nkrumah's policies as undermining their authority and privileges, which sowed seeds of discontent. Economic difficulties exacerbated public frustration. Ghana's ambitious industrialization and social programs had strained government finances, leading to inflation, food shortages, and declining living standards. Many Ghanaians, including influential business sectors and professional groups, questioned the sustainability of Nkrumah's policies and the state's capacity to deliver on its promises. Moreover, Nkrumah's international alignments complicated Ghana's domestic situation. His close ties with socialist countries during the Cold War alarmed Western powers, particularly the United States and Britain, who had vested interests in maintaining influence in West Africa. There is considerable historical debate about the extent to which foreign intelligence agencies may have been involved in or supported efforts to destabilize his regime. On February 24, 1966, while Nkrumah was on a state visit to North Vietnam and China, a military coup d'etat was launched in Accra. The National Liberation Council, NLC, composed primarily of military and police officers, seized power, declaring the CPP government dissolved. The coup was relatively bloodless, but symbolized the abrupt end of Nkrumah's political reign. The NLC justified their actions by citing the need to restore political stability, address economic mismanagement, and reinstate democratic governance. They accused Nkrumah's government of authoritarianism, corruption, and economic misrule. However, many saw the coup as a rejection of Nkrumah's revolutionary Pan-Africanism and socialist policies. Stripped of power, Nkrumah never returned to Ghana. Instead, he spent the remainder of his life in exile, primarily in Guinea, where he was honored with the title of honorary co-president by President Ahmed Sékou Touré. Guinea became a sanctuary where Nkrumah continued to advocate for African unity and socialism, albeit without the political power he once wielded. In exile, Nkrumah wrote extensively, producing works that analyzed imperialism, neocolonialism, and the future of Africa. His writings underscored his belief that the overthrow of his government was part of a broader pattern of external interference aimed at maintaining Western dominance on the continent. Although removed from direct political influence, Nkrumah remained a revered figure among many Africans and Pan-Africanists worldwide. His vision and efforts had left an indelible mark on the continent's liberation struggles, inspiring generations to continue the fight against colonialism and neocolonialism. Nkrumah's exile years were also marked by personal hardship. He faced health challenges and financial difficulties, relying on the support of fellow African leaders and sympathizers. Yet his commitment to the Pan-African cause remained steadfast until his death in 1972. Kwame Nkrumah's legacy transcends the historical events of his life and resonates deeply in the political, social, and ideological fabric of Africa and beyond. His pioneering role in the struggle for independence and his vision for a united Africa established him as one of the continent's most iconic and influential figures. Understanding his legacy requires an examination of the ways in which his ideas, leadership, and actions have continued to shape African politics, identity, and development. Nkrumah's insistence on self-determination laid the groundwork for the wave of independence movements that swept across Africa in the decades following Ghana's liberation. His successful challenge to colonial rule became a symbolic blueprint and source of inspiration for other African nations seeking freedom. The emotional and symbolic power of Ghana's independence under his leadership instilled hope and courage in countless activists. Beyond political liberation, Nkrumah's legacy is deeply embedded in Pan-African ideology. His advocacy for continental unity influenced the creation of regional and continental organizations aimed at fostering cooperation and solidarity among African states. The African Union, AU, which succeeded the Organization of African Unity, carries forward principles that echo Nkrumah's vision of political and economic integration. Nkrumah's promotion of socialism as a framework for African development has left a complex legacy. While some post-colonial African governments adopted elements of his economic philosophy, many struggled to implement it effectively amidst global capitalist pressures and internal challenges. Nevertheless, his critique of neocolonialism remains a foundational perspective in African political thought and development studies. In Ghana, Nkrumah's imprint is visible in national symbols, institutions, and public memory. Monuments, schools, and public squares bear his name, and his image continues to be invoked in political discourse. Despite periods of political opposition and varying interpretations of his rule, Nkrumah remains a unifying figure in Ghanaian history and identity. Critically, Nkrumah's legacy also involves reflection on the challenges and contradictions of his leadership. His authoritarian tendencies and the economic difficulties experienced under his administration have been subjects of analysis and debate. These aspects have prompted discussions about governance, democracy, and development models suitable for Africa's diverse realities. Internationally, Nkrumah is recognized as a trailblazer who challenged imperialism and advocated for the dignity and rights of colonized peoples worldwide. His works and speeches continue to be studied in academic institutions globally, and his life story inspires movements for social justice and anti-imperialism across continents. Nkrumah's impact extends to cultural realms as well. His emphasis on African identity fostered a renaissance in the arts, literature, and education, encouraging pride in African heritage and the rejection of colonial cultural domination. This cultural revival contributed to a broader consciousness that fueled political and social movements. In recent years, scholars and political leaders have revisited Nkrumah's writings and policies to extract lessons for contemporary challenges such as globalization, economic dependency, and political fragmentation. His holistic approach to development, combining political freedom with social and economic justice, remains relevant for current debates on sustainable development. Ultimately, Kwame Nkrumah's legacy is one of vision, struggle, and inspiration. His life encapsulates the aspirations and complexities of a continent striving to redefine itself after centuries of subjugation. While his era ended abruptly, the ideals he championed continue to resonate, guiding Africa's ongoing journey toward unity, dignity, and prosperity.